There is a cardboard box in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library that does not photograph well. No gold seal, no velvet rope, just paper. Hundreds of sheets of it, some on hotel stationery, some on the ruled yellow pads he used for speeches, some torn from a notepad in the residence and folded twice so they would fit under a door. Almost all of them written by one man to one woman. Many of them written when that woman was in the same house. A few of them written when she was in the very next room. He signed them in ways no speechwriter ever drafted. I love you more than anyone in the whole wide world. Sometimes just the letters. I, T, T, W, W, W. Sometimes he wrote to her as Mommy, which historians have found awkward for 40 years and which he never once explained. He wrote on their anniversary, on her birthday, on ordinary Tuesdays, from Camp David, from a ranch above Santa Barbara, and from a hospital bed in March of 1981 with a bullet hole under his arm. And here is the part that is never fit. Every person who tried to get close to Ronald Reagan, his biographers, his aides, his own children, came away describing the same thing. A pleasant, decent, genuinely warm man with a door in him that would not open. His authorized biographer spent 14 years inside his life and confessed in print that he could not find the person underneath. His son said he was raised by a father who was affectionate to everyone and intimate with no one. His other son, adopted, told a story about his own high school graduation, standing in a cap and gown, when his father walked up, put out a hand and said, "My name is Ronald Reagan. What's yours?" So we are left with two facts that refuse to sit in the same room. A man nobody could reach, and a stack of the most unguarded love letters any American president ever wrote. The woman who kept them said the marriage was the great love story of the century. The woman who kept them also once wrote, in her own memoir, that there was a wall around her husband, that he let her come closer than he let anyone, and that even so, there was a distance she never crossed in 52 years. Both of those sentences are hers. She published them roughly a decade apart. This is the story of a marriage the American public was allowed to watch constantly and understand almost not at all. Along the way, we are going to walk through an abandoned child left with an aunt for 6 years, a bad wedding with 2 witnesses who were not speaking to each other, a daughter who wrote a novel about her mother and then a memoir that was worse, a San Francisco astrologer who was quietly consulted on the movements of the leader of the free world, a mastectomy 9 days before her mother's death, an accusation of an affair with Frank Sinatra that has never been proven and never quite died, and 10 years at the end in which the man who wrote all those letters no longer knew who she was. And underneath all of it, one question. Were those letters the proof of the deepest marriage in modern political history? Or were they the receipts of a woman who could only reach her husband on paper? Pour yourself something, get comfortable, and let's go find out. Start with the child, because everything Nancy Reagan later did to her husband's schedule, staff, and reputation begins there. She was born Anne Frances Robbins in New York City on July 6, 1921. She would spend most of her adult life insisting the year was 1923. It was not. Her own college records give her away. That 2-year lie is a small thing, and it is worth holding on to, because it is the first evidence of a lifelong habit. When the record was unflattering, she edited it. Her mother was Edith Luckett, a working stage actress, funny, profane, relentlessly social, a woman who collected famous friends the way other people collect stamps. Her father was Kenneth Robbins, a car salesman whose chief contribution to his daughter's life was leaving it. The marriage collapsed almost immediately. Edith had a career, no money, and no husband, and touring companies do not accommodate toddlers. So in 1923, she took her daughter to Bethesda, Maryland, handed her to her sister Virginia, and went back to work. The girl stayed there roughly 6 years. Consider what 6 years is at that age. It is the entire construction of a self. Her mother appeared occasionally, a rush of perfume and stories and famous names, and then a train timetable. Nancy would later describe this period in the softest possible language. Her mother had to work, she understood. She was happy with her aunt and uncle. Every biographer who has looked at it has drawn a harder line. Karen Tumulty, whose 2021 study is the most sympathetic full-length treatment Nancy Reagan has ever received, treats those 6 years as the load-bearing wall of the entire personality. The abandonment that produced a woman who, given something of her own, would never again let it out of her sight. Rescue came in 1929, and it came in the form of a man. Edith married Loyal Davis, a Chicago neurosurgeon. Brilliant, rigid, socially conservative, and by several accounts a bigot of the casual country club variety. He gave the family a Lakeshore Drive address and a place in Chicago society. In 1935, at 14, Nancy asked to be adopted by him and became Nancy Davis. Read that sequence carefully. She did not simply acquire a stepfather. She asked to be legally rewritten as his child. At 14, she had already learned the central lesson of her life. Identity is not something you are given, it is something you attach yourself to. She went to Smith College, studied drama, and by her own cheerful admission was not a serious student. She wanted the stage, and her mother's contact book opened doors. Broadway work, then a screen test, then a contract at MGM in 1949. She made 11 films. She was competent and pleasant and completely unremarkable. The studio cast her, over and over, as the wife. In her own studio questionnaire, she listed her greatest ambition, and the answer has been quoted so often it has almost stopped meaning anything: to have a successful, happy marriage. She was 28, in a business that discarded women at 30, and she was hunting. Now bring in the man, and notice that when they meet, he is the wounded one. In 1949, Ronald Reagan was 38 years old and coming apart quietly. He had been the golden boy of Warner Brothers before the war. He came back to find the industry had moved on. Worse, his marriage had ended in public. Jane Wyman, a genuinely major star who would win the Academy Award for Johnny Belinda, had filed for divorce, and the reason she gave has become one of the small, cruel jokes of American history. She was, she said, bored to death by his politics. He talked about the Screen Actors Guild at dinner. He talked about communists in the unions. He would not stop talking. There was more underneath it. In June of 1947, the couple had a daughter, Christine, born prematurely. She lived less than a day. Reagan was in the hospital himself with viral pneumonia and nearly died in the same week. The marriage did not survive that year. The divorce was final in 1949, and by every account from the period he did not want it and did not understand it. Friends describe him in that stretch as a man dating a great many women, none of them seriously, and going home alone to an apartment to write. Then, in the autumn of 1949, Nancy Davis found that her name had turned up on a list. The story as she told it for the next 60 years is this. There were Communist Front organizations circulating petitions in Hollywood, and a Nancy Davis appeared on some of them, and she was terrified of being blacklisted for someone else's politics. She went to her director, Mervyn LeRoy. LeRoy said the man to fix this was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. A dinner was arranged, ostensibly to discuss the matter. Reagan arrived on crutches. He had broken his leg in a charity softball game, and said he could not stay long. They closed the restaurant, then went to a nightclub, then stayed for the second show. It is a wonderful story. It is also, several biographers have pointed out, slightly too well built. There were at least 4 women named Nancy Davis working in Hollywood. The confusion was real, and it was also trivially fixable by a phone call from a studio publicist. Bob Colacello, in his exhaustive account of the couple's pre-political years, is the most direct about it. Whatever the paperwork problem was, the meeting was engineered, and Nancy did the engineering. Kitty Kelly, in the hostile 1991 unauthorized biography, goes much further and treats the whole episode as a seduction operation. We should be careful here. Kelly's book is a document that has to be handled with gloves on. It was reported at speed. It leans heavily on unnamed sources and on people with grievances, and portions of it have never been corroborated by anyone. But it did get one significant thing right, which we will come to, and that single accuracy is precisely why the rest of it has never fully gone away. What is not in dispute is the courtship's length. They met in late 1949. They did not marry until March of 1952. More than 2 years. During those 2 years, Reagan continued to see other women, and Nancy's friends from the period describe her waiting and being humiliated by the waiting, and waiting anyway. She got him in the end, but look at the terms of the surrender, because the wedding tells you everything. March 4th, 1952. The little brown church in the valley, in North Hollywood. No press, no family, not her mother, not his mother, not his children. 2 witnesses, the actor William Holden and his wife Ardis. Holden was Reagan's friend. He was also, that particular afternoon, in the middle of a serious fight with his own wife. The 2 of them stood up for the Reagans without speaking to each other. That is the wedding of the great American love story. A small church, 4 adults, 1 silent marital war in the witness box, and a photograph afterward at the Holden's house, where the bride looks less radiant than relieved. Now do the arithmetic that Nancy Reagan spent 40 years hoping nobody would do. Patricia Ann Reagan was born on October 22, 1952. The wedding was March 4th. That is 7.5 months. Kelly put that in print in 1991 and was widely accused of gutter journalism for it. Kelly was right. Nancy had been pregnant at the altar, and the modern consensus, including from writers entirely sympathetic to her, accepts it. Reagan himself, in a letter to a friend written years later, referred to their first child arriving a bit ahead of schedule with something close to amusement. The fact itself is nothing. In 1952, it was everything. And, more importantly, it was leverage. Whatever else the courtship had been, the marriage happened on a deadline. And there is one more thing hidden in that date. The delay, the other women, the 2 years of waiting. Set that beside a 2-year-old handed to an aunt in Maryland, and the shape of the next 5 decades becomes legible. She had been left once. She was not going to be left again. Whatever it took. The first crack does not appear in the marriage. It appears in the children, and it never really closes. Reagan came into the marriage with 2, Maureen, born 1941, and Michael, adopted in 1945. Then came Patty in 1952, and Ron Jr. in 1958. 4 children, 2 households, 1 father who had already demonstrated he could survive a family ending. The Reagan house in Pacific Palisades has been described by everyone who grew up in it as pleasant, sunny, and strangely empty of contact. The children were sent to boarding schools early. Michael has written that he spent his childhood convinced he was the outsider in a family that already had a full roster. And, devastatingly, that he was molested by a camp counselor as a small boy and told nobody in that house, for years, because there was no one in it he believed would absorb it. Then there is the graduation. Michael, in cap and gown, approached by his father, who extends a hand and introduces himself to his own son. Michael has told the story publicly many times, and he has always told it the same way. He was not being cruel. He genuinely did not recognize the face under the mortarboard. Patty got the worst of it, and she got it from the other direction. Her fight was never really with her father, who floated above the household weather. It was with her mother. In 1986, she published a novel, Homefront, about a politically ambitious family with a cold, controlling mother. A book nobody had any difficulty decoding. Then, in 1992, with her parents out of the White House, she published a memoir, The Way I See It, and stopped decoding anything. In it, she alleged that her mother had struck her, repeatedly, from childhood into adolescence. She wrote that her mother relied on prescription tranquilizers. She described a house in which the surface was the entire product, and any crack in it was punished. Nancy denied it. Ron Jr., who has never been shy about contradicting the family myth on other matters, has said he did not witness the violence Patty described, while also being clear that his sister and his mother were locked in something poisonous from very early on. There is no third-party evidence, and there is not going to be. What exists is one daughter's sworn account and one mother's flat denial, and the reader has to sit with both. Here is what interests me more than adjudicating it. Every account of that household, friendly, hostile, and neutral, agrees on the architecture. Ronald Reagan was pleasant and absent. Nancy Reagan was present and absolute. And all 4 children, in 4 different registers and 4 different decades, reached for the same word. Not cruel, not cold exactly, unreachable. That is the wall, and the man on the other side of it wrote his wife love letters from the next room. So what was she doing in there with him, on her side of the wall? She was building the only structure she had ever trusted, total control of the perimeter. You can see it forming through the California years. Reagan left acting for General Electric, touring plants and giving speeches, and drifted right. In 1966, he ran for governor and won. Sacramento is where the machinery gets built. Nancy loathed the governor's mansion, an old fire trap downtown, and within months had the family moved to a rented house in a better neighborhood, paid for by a group of wealthy friends. Those friends, the group later known as the Kitchen Cabinet, would fund and manage her husband for the next 20 years, and she curated them personally. That is the pattern, and it never changes. Reagan supplied the face, the voice, and the convictions. Nancy supplied the environment. Who got near him, who was fed to him, who was quietly removed. She did not argue ideology. She almost never did. Lou Cannon, who covered Reagan longer and more closely than any other journalist, made this point repeatedly. Nancy Reagan had no discernible political philosophy at all. What she had was a permanent, ruthless read on which people were useful to her husband and which were hurting him, and a willingness to act on that read while he was still being charming to everyone in the room. And she developed the public performance that would define her, the gaze. Head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on him, absolutely motionless while he spoke. Cartoonists ate it. Feminists despaired of it. Nancy said all her life that she was simply listening. Read one way, that is a wife's devotion, and it is beautiful. Turned over, it is the most effective piece of political staging of the television era. A woman telling 40 million people, without a word, that this man is worth looking at. Both readings are true. That is what made it work. Then, in January of 1981, they moved into a house where the perimeter could not be controlled, and 70 days later, someone shot her husband. March 30th, 1981. Reagan leaves the Washington Hilton after a speech. John Hinckley Jr. fires 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. A bullet ricochets off the limousine, enters under the president's left arm, and stops about an inch from his heart. Press Secretary James Brady takes a round in the head and will never recover. A police officer and a Secret Service agent are hit. Nancy was at the White House. She was told there had been shooting and that her husband was not hurt. That was wrong. She got to George Washington University Hospital and was initially kept from him, and she said afterward, flatly, without ornament, that if he died, she did not know what she would do, because she did not intend to survive it. Reagan, on the gurney, told her he forgot to duck. The line went around the world in a day. He also, from his hospital bed, wrote her a letter. The country got the joke. Nancy got the 60 seconds of arithmetic, an inch. She never recovered from it, and every strange thing she did over the following 7 years, and there were strange things, traces back to that inch, including the Astrologer. Sometime after the shooting, through their friend Merv Griffin, Nancy was reconnected with Joan Quigley, a San Francisco socialite and professional astrologer. Quigley told her she could have seen it coming. What followed is not a rumor. Nancy Reagan retained Quigley, paid privately, never on any public payroll, and for years ran the president's schedule past her. Good days and bad days, travel that should be moved, times of day that were safe. The president's chief of staff, Ronald Reagan, found himself operating a color-coded calendar to accommodate an astrologer he had never met. And in 1988, after Nancy engineered his removal, he wrote it all down in his memoir and detonated it in public. Quigley then published her own book, confirming her role and considerably inflating it, claiming influence over summit timing and speech scheduling. The White House response was a masterpiece of narrow language. No policy decision was ever based on astrology. Note what that sentence does not deny. Nancy herself, in her memoir, admitted the consultations and framed them as what they were, not belief, but a woman who had nearly lost her husband to 2 seconds of gunfire, trying to buy back a feeling of control. Now hold those two things side by side. The most powerful office on earth, and in the residence upstairs, a frightened woman with a private chart, moving her husband's schedule the way you might move furniture away from a window. Before the Astrologer became public, though, the country had already decided it disliked her, and the reason was China. The first 18 months in the White House were, by any measure, a disaster for her personally. The country was in a brutal recession, unemployment climbing toward double digits, and the new First Lady arrived with a program of renovation. Roughly $800,000 in privately raised money went into redoing the residence. A new state china service, more than 4,000 pieces, was ordered at a cost of over $200,000. Also privately funded, and announced, with catastrophic timing, in the same news cycle as proposed cuts to school lunch programs. Then came the dresses. She was borrowing designer gowns and, in a number of cases, not returning them, which brushed against federal ethics rules on gifts. A magazine cover crowned her Queen Nancy. Her favorability collapsed to a level no First Lady had seen in the polling era. What she did next is, I think, the single most underrated act of political skill in that administration. At the Gridiron Club dinner in March of 1982, white tie, the entire Washington press corps in the room, Nancy Reagan walked on stage in a costume of mismatched rags and feathers and sang a parody of Second-Hand Rose. Second-hand clothes. She mocked the china, the borrowing, the whole indictment, in front of the people who had written it. At the end, she smashed a plate. The room came apart. The coverage turned inside a week. Shortly afterward came Just Say No, the anti-drug campaign that began, by her account, with a schoolgirl in Oakland asking what to do if someone offered her drugs. It became her identity, and for the rest of the decade she was on television in classrooms and on sitcoms. The policy legacy is genuinely contested. The political legacy is not. The Dragon Lady became the concerned mother of the nation, and it took about 24 months. She had proved she could rebuild an image from wreckage. Remember that. She would need the skill one more time, on a much larger subject. Because the same woman who could not be trusted with a China budget turned out to be the reason the Cold War ended the way it did, or so one camp of historians insists, and this is where the serious disagreement lives. The case for it goes roughly like this. From 1985 onward, Nancy Reagan pushed her husband, hard and continuously, toward negotiation with Mikhail Gorbachev. Not because she had a theory of Soviet reform, she did not, but because she wanted him remembered as a peacemaker rather than the man who called it an evil empire. She sided against the hardliners in his own administration. She cultivated a back channel with the Soviet ambassador. When Iran-Contra broke and the administration was drowning, it was Nancy who concluded that Ronald Reagan had to go, and Nancy who kept applying pressure until he went, in February of 1987, after which the administration steadied and the arms control track survived. Karen Tumulty's 2021 biography makes this argument at length and with receipts, that the marriage was the actual governing partnership, that his instincts were real, but his management was catastrophic, and that she functioned as the ruthlessness he was constitutionally incapable of. Lou Cannon, who was there, agreed that she was his most important advisor and drew a sharp boundary around it. Her interventions were about personnel and reputation, not policy. She removed people, she did not write positions. Bob Colacello, who had extraordinary access to her, reads the whole arc as social ambition arriving at its logical destination. A woman who spent her life curating rooms and finally got the biggest room there is. And Kitty Kelly's version, that she was a manipulative, pill-taking climber whose marriage was substantially a performance, remains the one most people absorbed, because scandal travels and correction does not. 4 serious writers, 4 incompatible verdicts on the same woman, and notice that not one of them claims to be able to tell you what Ronald Reagan actually thought about any of it, because he told nobody, ever. including his authorized biographer, who spent 14 years on the project and produced a book that essentially confesses defeat, calling him the most mysterious man he had ever confronted. His wife was the only person who got past the door, and even she, in print, said she never got all the way in. Then came 1987, and the bill arrived all at once. In October, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and on October 17th underwent a mastectomy. She chose the more radical operation over a lumpectomy and was publicly criticized for it by physicians who worried about the example she set for other women, an extraordinary thing to say to a patient, and she said later it enraged her. 9 days after the surgery, on October 26th, her mother died. Edith had been the great presence of her life, the woman who left her in Maryland, and the woman she adored anyway. Nancy flew to Phoenix for the funeral while still recovering from major surgery, and by every account of that autumn, she came apart in private more thoroughly than at any other point in her adult life. Her stepfather, Loyal Davis, was already gone in 1982. And on top of that, in the same 12 months, Iran-Contra hearings, the firing of the chief of staff, the astrology story about to break, and a husband nearing his final year in office who was, several people around him have since suggested, already occasionally not quite there. That is the tally. Cancer, her mother, her father, her husband's presidency in flames, all inside a single stretch of months. She lost none of it publicly, not once. She did the gays on schedule. They went home to California in January 1989, and then she did the thing that ties this entire story together. She started publishing. Her memoir, My Turn, appeared later that year, and it is a genuinely strange book, score-settling, defensive, weirdly candid in places. It confirms the Astrologer. It goes after Ronald Reagan. It admits, in language nobody has ever improved on, that there was a wall around her husband, that she was allowed nearer than anyone, and that there was still a distance. The most devoted wife in American public life put that in her own book. In 1994 came the letter, his, not hers. On November 5th, in his own handwriting, Ronald Reagan told the country he had Alzheimer's disease, and wrote that he now began the journey that would lead him into the sunset of his life. Then he went quiet, permanently. And in 2000, with her husband alive and no longer able to consent to any of it, Nancy Reagan opened the boxes and published his love letters. Think about what that act actually is. The generous reading. A woman losing her husband by inches, sharing the proof of what he was so the record would show it. The colder reading. The final and most sophisticated image campaign of a career built on image campaigns. The same instinct that produced the Gridiron song, deployed one last time, using the private words of a man who could no longer object. And the letters do not say what people assume they say. Read a stack of them in sequence, and the effect is not warmth, it is longing. He writes to her as though she were far away when she is downstairs. He apologizes for distances she has not complained about. He tells her, over and over, in slightly different words, that she is the whole world, and he writes it, rather than saying it, because writing was the only room in his life with the door open. That is the marriage. Not a fairy tale, a correspondence. Two people in the same house for 52 years, one of them mailing himself out under the door, the other collecting every envelope and, eventually, publishing them. The last decade was the part nobody was allowed to see, and she was the one who made sure of it. Ronald Reagan's Alzheimer's ran 10 years. The ranch he loved, Rancho del Cielo, was sold in 1998. He could no longer be safely there, and by then the memory of it was going too. Nancy shrank her life down to almost nothing. A house in Bel Air, a handful of friends, a nurse's schedule. She called it the long goodbye, and the phrase stuck because it was exact. Ron Jr. has described the end of it plainly. By the last stretch, his father did not know his wife. The man who had written thousands of pages to her had no idea who the woman sitting beside him was. She sat there anyway, for years, in a room with a stranger she had spent her whole life not being left by. He died on June 5, 2004, at 93. At the funeral, at the library in Simi Valley, she stayed composed through everything: the rotunda, the Capitol, the cathedral, the flight home, until the very end, when the flag came off the casket and was folded and put in her arms at sunset. She put her cheek against it. That is the one moment in 50 years of public life in which Nancy Reagan visibly stopped performing. Then she did the last job, 12 more years of curating him. She fought publicly for embryonic stem cell research against her own party because it might have helped people with what he had. She managed the library, the legacy, the record. Patty came home finally. The reconciliation in those years was real, and both of them wrote about it afterward. Maureen had already died of melanoma in 2001 at 60. Nancy Reagan died on March 6, 2016 at 94 of congestive heart failure in the Bel Air house. She had outlived her husband by 11 years and 9 months. They had been married 52 years and 3 months. She was buried beside him at the library on the hill facing west. Do the final arithmetic on that life. 6 years handed off to an aunt. 2 years waiting for a man who was seeing other women. 7.5 months from the altar to the baby. 52 years of marriage. An inch from the heart in 1981. 10 years of a husband who did not know her. 11 years and 9 months alone. So, what was in the box? Not what we were told. The public was sold a fairy tale, the adoring gaze, the ranch, the perfect couple who held hands into old age. And the fairy tale was not exactly false. That is what makes this one hard. He did love her, extravagantly, in writing, without irony, for half a century. The letters are real. But a fairy tale is a story with no cost in it, and this marriage had costs, and other people paid most of them. 4 children raised in the outer ring of a 2-person orbit. A daughter who had to write 2 books to get her mother's attention. A son introduced to his own father at his graduation. A chief of staff removed by a woman who held no office. An astrologer quietly shaping the movements of a president. And at the center, a woman who had learned at 2 years old that people leave, and who built, out of sheer will, a life in which one man never could. She got what she wanted. She wrote it down at 28 on a studio form, a successful, happy marriage. She got 52 years of it, and she paid for it with everything else, and at the end she sat for a decade in a room with a man who could not remember her name. That cardboard box in the library is still there. Hundreds of letters, most of them written by a man who could not say any of it out loud, to a woman standing on the other side of a wall neither of them ever named. America was shown the gaze. What it was never shown was the door. Closed from the inside for 52 years, with love notes coming under it. If this story got to you, do me a favor. Hit the like button. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because these are the ones the algorithm buries. Tell me in the comments what you think those letters really were. Proof of the greatest love story of the century, or the most beautiful evidence of a distance neither of them could close. And if you want another one right now, there's a video on your screen that I think you'll want next. Thanks for spending this time with me. See you in the next one.